done?
I can listen. If you want to listen, I can.
Rabosai, today's daf is daf Chaf Aleph, and we'll begin on the last line on daf Chaf Amud Beis, my time of Rabbi Yehuda. But just to reiterate what we saw yesterday, Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that in order to create an ohel, we need a human component. And Rashi, you'll see on the last line of the Chaf Amud Beis, says miskaven lasos ohel, that a person has to have in mind that he is creating an ohel. There were many scenarios in which nature created an ohel. That's not an ohel, and that's not valid according to Rabbi Yehuda. And the Gemara asks my taima, and that's how we begin today's daf Chaf Aleph. Yolif ohel mimishkan. We have what's called Gzeira Shava, and the word ohel appears in two in two different contexts. It appears in the context of Tumas Mes, which is Parshas Chukas, the parsha of the Parah Aduma, and there the Torah says, Zos HaTorah Adam Ki Yomos Ba'ohel. So we emphasize the word ohel. And Ksiv Hasam. Now we're in the parsha of creating the Mishkan. And with regard to the Mishkan, the Torah says, Vayifros es ha'ohel, again emphasizing the word ohel, al ha-Mishkan. And in the case of the Mishkan, Moshe Rabbeinu established the Mishkan. So it was a human endeavor, a human effort to create the Mishkan. And based on the word ohel that appears in both contexts, we derive the following conclusion. Mala halon, just like in the case of Mishkan, the ohel was created b'dei Adam, and so too, Afkan here too, with regard to Tumas ohel, is b'dei Adam. It's got to be a human creation in order to qualify as an ohel. Lafuke, to the exclusion of different situations in which nature created an ohel. Like, for example, we mentioned the animals that burrow and create a cavity with an ohel, a shelter on top. That's not an ohel according to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbanan, they disagree. Ohel riba. In the parsha Parah Aduma, the word ohel appears time after time, and that creates what's called a ribui. And the ribui is coming to tell you that even if the ohel was not created by human effort, but rather by nature, it still qualifies as an ohel. And this is the machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, and we're going to see in Ritz Hashem as we go along more and more about this machlokes. At this particular juncture, the Gemara is going to quote a Mishnah in Masechet Parah, and this Mishnah apparently contradicts Rabbi Yehuda as we have him now, based on olos. And Rabbi Yehuda is going to recognize and validate an ohel that's an animal. An animal could be an ohel, which is not bidei Adam. There's no human element here. It's purely bidei Shamayim. And yet, Rabbi Yehuda is going to validate it as an ohel. Now, to put this Mishnah in Parah Aduma into context, there's some Kohen who's designated as what we call Kohen Asoref Es HaParah. He's in charge of burning the Parah Aduma. At the time of the great controversy between the Prushim and the Tzdokim were of the opinion that anyone who was part of the process of creating the Parah Aduma, the Mechatos, had to be in a pure state of Tara. And the Prushim, based on various drashos, understood that Torah Sheba'al Peh recognized and validated a Tvul Yom. Tvul Yom is someone who's only Tameh for one day. He goes to the mikvah on that day, and then with Hariv Shemesh, with sunset, he becomes star. A Tvul Yom, according to the Prushim, is kosher for Sreifas HaParah. However, the Rabbanan were in a kind of a bind. They wanted to come very strongly and make a demonstration against the tztokim, and therefore they felt it was necessary to deliberately be metame the soref, the Kohen HaSoref Sapar, to actually see to it that he has contact with the sheretz or whatever it is, and make him into a Tful Yom, and then he would go ahead and burn the paraduma. This was a public demonstration against the tztokim who said that a Tful Yom is possible, he's disqualified for Sreifas HaParah. But now the Rabbanim find themselves in a bind, because all other dimensions of preparing the mechatas and the paraduma require absolute tara. And the fear was that if we deliberately mitame, we contaminate the Kohen HaSorev for the purpose, the agenda of Lafuke to exclude the tztukim, then people might come to be mezalzel or be lenient with regard to other dimensions of Tumah V'Tara, like for example, Tamei Mes, who's completely invalidated, excluded from paraduma. So they're sort of grabbing, from both ends. On the one hand, they're going to guarantee that the person who's the Soref Esapara is the Tful Yom. He's Tamei to some extent. Again, he went to the mikvah, but he needs Hariv Shemesh. But at the same time, they can go overboard in order to get out the word and impress the people that we have to be very careful about all laws of Tara. And the Mishnah that we're about to learn in Masechet Parah is going to address these various super duper chumras, where we're very strict and very severe to avoid any outside possibility of Tumas Mems. So the Gemara asks the Sover, Rabbi Yehuda kol oel she'eno osu b'dei adam eno oel. If it was created by nature, not by man, it's not an oel. V'Rabbeinu, I'll ask you a stira. We have a Mishnah that says that chatzeros hayu binuyos b'Yushalayim al gabi hasela. There were certain courtyards that apparently date back to the time of creation. And they were built in Yerushalayim on top of a very large boulder. And this boulder, as I said, dates back to Sheshis Yimei Bereishis. And therefore, there was always a fear that underneath the boulder, there might have been a kever, somebody was buried there. V'tachteihem halal. Underneath these courtyards, there was empty space. And they built these courtyards on top of this large boulder, underneath which there was empty space, what we call halal. And now we have a fear of what's called kever hatahom. Kever hatahom is a combination of two ingredients, A plus B. A is what's called tumah ritzutza. Tumah ritzutza means that if there's tumah underground and the corpse or part of the body is immediately underground, so to speak, smothered underground, then the tumah goes all the way up ad lashamayim. So we have to worry about the possibility of walking over a grave if we want to avoid tumah. The other element here in the equation is suffix. We don't know for sure that there's a grave there, but there may be a grave there. There may be someone who was buried there. So what we're going to do is now, in order to avoid what's called tumah ritzutza, which is bokas viola ad l'rakia, to make sure that there's no kever, what they did was they built chatzeros, they built these courtyards, and they were structured on top of poles. They were held up by vertical poles. And therefore, what would guarantee is that there's no tumor ritzutza. Why? Because even in the worst case scenario, if there's a kever that's buried underneath the ground, there's airspace between the ground and the bottom level of the chutzah. So anyone on top of the courtyard who's walking on that wall is in effect walking on air. You'll see it, by the way, in Israel. A lot of old apartments are built on amudim, what they call. And that airspace guarantees that even in the worst case scenario, if there's a kever below, it's not tumor ritzutza, because as I said before, tumor ritzutza means that the corpse is, so to speak, smothered almost at ground level. There's not even a tefach of airspace. But here we have a great deal of airspace, and therefore on top of these chatzeros, we are completely protected against tumas tahom. Ever tahom. Umevim noshim ubros v'yoldo shab. We now have to guarantee that the baby that's born, from the moment it's born, is tar, because it's this child, as it grows up, who is going to bring whatever we need to make this concoction called the mechatas. Now, from its birth, this child is guaranteed to be tar. So what do? We bring the pregnant women who are ready to give birth to that courtyard, and we know that that courtyard is completely tar, and it doesn't even have a kever tahom. Umegadlos b'neihem sham. They will raise their children in that chutzah, in that courtyard, which is guaranteed to be tar, until the child is approximately 7 or 8 years old. Now, the significance of 7 or 8 means that the child is less than 9. If the child is less than 9, then we assume, this may be a physiological assumption, or more likely a halachic assumption, just pure legal assumption, that he's not royal tumas carried. In other words, if a child would have some sort of seminal emission before the age of 9, that would not generate any tumor. So we know that this child, who is 8 years old, who is raised since birth in these chatzeros, is certainly tar. What else? Now we're ready for the Maisa Paraduma. And I guess this 8-year-old is quite mature. He's beyond his age, so he's ready to participate. And what we need is what's called mechatas. Mechatas means that we're going to draw water, and these yeladim, these children, these young, let's say a young boy of 8 years old, will fill up a cup with water, and that will be used as part of the concoction with the Efer HaPara to create what we call mechatas b'tara. Okay? Now, the problem here is, this is the challenge, we have to transport this water in order to mix it with the Efer HaPara. And once we start transporting, once again, we have the problem that the child who's going from his original chotzer, we'll see where he has to get to bring the mayim for the mechatos, he may go over a kever tahom. So what we have to do is we have to guarantee that he's being carried on the shoulders of something that is an OL. If he's on top of an OL, then he is protected from any tumas kever tahom. So what could transport the child and yet guarantee that it is an OL? Mivim shvarim. They bring an ox. The algabeim dulosos. On top of these oxen, they place a door, but not in a vertical position. In this case, in a horizontal position. And this door is what's called a kli eitz, Okay, I'm going to ask you to please, if you can mute your phone. I still don't know how to do that. For some reason, I've been trying for over 2 years now to figure out how to do this. And Tinokos Yoshim al Gabean. So the children are sitting on top of these doors. And the doors are meant to guarantee that the children will not stretch their legs over into airspace beyond the doors, these flat wooden things, because then they might be exposed to kever to home. Kosel shel even. Now keep in mind that stone is not makabel tumah. So they had, instead of glassware, they used stoneware, and they had a cup made of stone, biyadeyah, and they filled up the stone cup with water. And Higiu, where did they have to get to? I'm going to add a word here, Mayan Hashiloch. You've heard of the Mayan Hashiloch, which is right near Yerushalayim, and that's where they would get the water that they knew was guaranteed to be taught. Now, how do the children get to dip their cup into the Mei Shiloach? Yardu l'toch hamayim umil'um. And today they wouldn't allow this. It would be a security issue. But in those days, the children were very advanced. So you had an 8-year-old boy, and he goes down into the Mei Shiloach, and he lifts up in this koshel even mayim, or the olav yashalem. They got back on top of the doors, and they brought the mayim. Where did the mayim have to get to? Its final location was the harabayis, and that's where the Kohen would mix the mayim with Efer Paraduma to create mechatos, and that's where he did the hazah. Now, how'd you get the Efer? How did you get the ashes of the parah? For that we needed a Kohen asorev es hapar. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Mimkomo Kohen v'shalshel umemale mipnei kever tahom. Rabbi Yossi says, I'm not going to be so lenient. I'm going to be even more strict and demanding and harsh. I'm not going to let the children go down from the oxen, but rather I'm going to require that they remain on top of the ox. And I guess with a rope, they would lower the kos into the Mei Shiloach. Mishalshel means to lower something with a rope. Umemale. And we're not going to take any chances whatsoever. Maybe there's a kever to home somewhere in this vicinity. Now that was a Mishnah, and now we have a brisa embellishing the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Lo hayu meviim delasos. Forget about the doors. El Shvarim. The children would ride on top of the oxen, on top of the ox. Now, the reason for the ox is to protect against tumas kever tahom, which means that the back of the ox is considered an oel, which means that the back is somehow protecting something. It's sheltering something, right? Because otherwise, if you don't have a cavity, then you don't have an oil on top of the cavity. Now, every animal, again, Stuart, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, has a rib cage, and inside the rib cage are his kishkis, his what's called in Hebrew the bnei me'ayin, so that the back of the shar, and we'll soon learn this from Apostle, is going to shelter the rib cage, which in turn is sheltering the kishkis, all the inner intestines, etc., of the animal. So now we see from this brisa that Rabbi Yehuda maintains that a shar, which is part of nature, it's not humanly created, is considered an oel and protects the child who's on top of it, who's riding the ox, from tumas kever tahom. There's no human creation and kavanah to create an oil. Nevertheless, the Brisa records that Rabbi Yehuda Omer lo hayu meviim tlasos el shmarim. If it would have been a deles, so then you could say that the deles itself is humanly created. It's manufactured by a carpenter, and he manufactured it with kavanah that the children will sit on top of these doors. And that was the opinion of the Tanna Kama. Rabbi Yehuda completely omits the dlasos. Now we see a contradiction between Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah and Olos, who maintains that an oil has to be created by a human creation, as opposed to the Brisa and Paraduma, which validates a shar as an oil. He also Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, Amar Rabbi Elazar, he reported and transmitted an answer to this question in the name of Rabbi Elazar. Moda Rabbi Yehuda Kimlo Egrov. Normally, the minimum requirement for an OL is what's called a tefach, the width of a tefach. However, there are different levels of OL. There's basic OL, and then there's advanced OL. Like, you take, math 101, and then you take advanced math. So there's an advanced level of an OL. And that's called Kimlo Egrov. And that means it has the size of a very large fist. The Chazal compared to the size of the head of a person. It's a lot more than a tefach. And that's considered an OL of the Ersh class, of the top level OL. Now, what's the difference between, why are we giving grades? Why are we giving you a ribbon? Oh, you're a top level OL. You have Kimole Egrov. The nafkamina is that if it's a top level OL, then even in a case of Bidei Shamayim, where there's no creation of the OL by human effort, Rabbi Yehuda himself will concede that we have an OL. And the chashivas of this OL is generated despite the fact that it wasn't a human creation. There's no kavanah to create on the part of a human being, by the fact that we have a very large OL that has a halal of kimole egrov. Like, for example, the shar, the ox, has a cavity inside its body, the back of the shar, the top of the shar, where you ride the shar. That is an OL that is protecting a large area of the kishkis of the shar, of the ox. And therefore, if you're talking about a small hole that was burrowed by an animal and it has the shear of a tefach, it normally would have been considered as an OL, except the Rabbi Yehuda Shita is that it has to be bidei adam and not bidei shamayim. But if you have a natural OL, like an animal the size of an ox, which is Kimole Egrov, then even Rabbi Yehuda agrees it's considered an OL, despite the fact that it was created by nature and not by human effort. Tanya Namiyachi, Moder Rabbi Yehuda b'shakifin. These are large boulders that when they fall down, let's say from a mountain, because the wind blows them down, as a result of the loss, the fall. You remember sometimes when you're on the highways, what does it say, fallen rock zone? Does that ring a bell? So you're in a fallen rock zone, and as a result of a boulder that fell, there's a very large cavity in the mountain. And Rabbi Yehuda agrees that in such a case, and also in the case of Mekike Asloim, these are very large crevices in boulders, in Sloim Gedolim, they are considered an OL. Why? Because the halal, the airspace, the cavity, is Kimole Egrov, even though they are part of the natural world. So the Gemara says, I don't get it. This statement of Rav Dimi is problematic. Ari deles yeshva kama egrofim. A deles, right? Usually, when you Again, we're not talking about a horizontal delis. We're not talking about a vertical delis, but rather a horizontal delis. So there's plenty of airspace between the delis and the ground. So the delis is now sheltering or hovering over a cavity that's more than a below egrof. How egrof? Many fists. Ukitani, nevertheless, the Brisa says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, lo hayu meviim dlasos el shmarim. Why did Rabbi Yehuda object to the Tanakama and leave out dlasos? We got to omit dlasos. Why? Dlasos certainly have a halal of many agrofim, and therefore the deles should qualify as an oil, which would protect the child from tahom, from kever tahom. Amar Abaye. No. We have to reinterpret the Brisa. Rabbi Yehuda said, not that I want to get rid of these glossos. What his point was, lo hutzachulavi glossos. There's no need to bring glossos. You already have an oil that will protect the child from contracting tumas tahom because you have the shmarim. And the ox itself is a very fine species of an oil because it has a halal of an egrof, and there's no need to bring glossos. Why bring glossos? But Rava says no. Lo hayamavim glossos kolikar. The simple pshat in Rabbi Yehuda and the Brisa is that they left out the glossos. It wasn't that he was adding and he was saying it's not necessary, but do it as you wish. I'm satisfied even without the delos with the shard. No. According to Rava's interpretation, Rabbi Yehuda objected to the glossos. There's a negative part of glossos. And why is that? Mipnei shedaito shel tinok dasa olav shemayotzi rosho o echad meivarov vitame bekever tahom. Well, let's try to understand what is going on here with this concept called daito shel tinok gasa olav. The way I understand it, it goes the following. If you've ever taken a young child to an amusement park, you'll know what I'm talking about. You put him on let's say a roller coaster or something of that sort, and the child will hang on to his parents for dear life. He's not going to move one iota to the left or to the right. He'll hold on, if there's a bar in front of him, he's going to hold on tightly. He doesn't have a sense of security. So imagine putting a child on top of a shar, on the back of an ox. Again, I can't even imagine it. The child is going to hold on to the reins for dear life. He won't look to the left or to the right. But if you put him on a deles, wow, this is a lot of fun. It's daito gasol. He's having a blast. He starts moving around like he's on a surfboard. He's having fun. He thinks, he could move with the deles. And what might happen is that he might stick his head out of the deles or a leg out because he's having such fun. It's a game for him. After all, he's all of 8 years old. And as a result, he might contract tumas tahom.